In the fall of 2025, the Trump administration came up with a compact for 9 top American universities where they said, we'll give you the federal funding that you're entitled to and have been expecting, but only in exchange for adopting our agenda to remake universities according to our conservative ideology, affecting how you do teaching and admissions. We will control what you do. Not surprisingly, almost all of those universities said, no, thank you. But consider what was in that compact. They would have to dismantle diversity programs. Interestingly, they would have to require standardized tests for admission. Not surprising on reflection that that's part of a right-wing set of requirements. And they would have to curb grade inflation. Grade inflation. Complaints about this obviously aren't limited to MAGA types because it's widely taken for granted that grades are inflated, that it's pervasive and pernicious. And everywhere you turn, you hear indignant expostulations about kids' sense of entitlement and so on, and hysterical language about grade inflation is a crisis, it's a scandal, it's an epidemic. It's like academic Chicken Littles running around. The grades are rising, the grades are rising. At Harvard, which gets a lot of attention for this, the problem started in the mid-90s. The 1890s, that is, where only 8 years after letter grades started at Harvard College, people in the faculty and administration were already complaining that A's were given out too readily. So, is grade inflation really a problem in high schools and colleges? What lies behind the complaints and often the unreflective assumptions underlying the complaints? That's our topic today on Cone Zone. I'm Alfie Cone. So there are 2 immediate problems with the grade inflation narrative. The first is the whole premise may be false. Are grades really rising? So most statistics that you read claiming that kids are getting a lot more A's now than at some point, and what is that point, by the way? That keeps shifting in order to make the argument. And what's the correct point in the past to compare with the present? But statistics claiming that there are more A's now than at some point in the past are almost always based on students' self-report of their grades. Some years ago, a statistician at the U.S. Department of Education did a study, which he later updated, looking at official transcripts, which offer a more accurate look at the actual grades. And the trend of grades going up virtually disappeared, which was then confirmed in his subsequent report as well. So it depends on if we're talking about high school versus college, very selective schools versus all schools, now versus when. At the very least, it's unclear whether grades are really going up. But the second problem is even if they are, that doesn't prove they're inflated. I mean, the burden is on critics to show that higher grades are undeserved. There are any number of possible alternative explanations for why grades might be going up. Maybe students are turning in better assignments now. Maybe teachers used to be too stingy and now have become more reasonable in their grading. Maybe the concept of assessment itself has evolved so that now more teachers are using grades as a means for allowing students to demonstrate what they know instead of trying to sort them or catch them out, in which case the real question we ought to be asking is, why did we spend so long trying to make good students look bad? What else? Maybe college students aren't forced to take as many courses outside their primary areas of interest where they didn't do as well. Maybe struggling students are now able to withdraw from a course before a poor grade appears on their transcripts. In sum, no one, to my knowledge, has ever demonstrated that students today get A's for the same work that used to receive B's or C's. That's just asserted, but not proved. But a lot of critics don't even bother to claim that grades have risen or that they're too generous. They just point to the number of students in a given school or class who get A's now, as if a sufficiently high number is like objectionable on its face. Stop and think about that for a while. A lot of kids are getting A's. They equate with grade inflation and assume that's terrible. Why? This reminds me of a comment made by a writer who was doing a profile of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. The writer said that Alito seems to be saying that the growing percentage of secular people is in itself a form of religious persecution. You see the analogy, I trust. So, what's going on here? Why do people assume that grade inflation exists just if there are a lot of students getting an A, regardless of whether they're undeserved, those grades, or have increased? Let me begin by observing here that to say that grades aren't just high but inflated, to say that they are, as one group of critics put it, less accurate now, assumes the existence of an objectively correct evaluation of what a student or a student's essay, say, deserves. There's a true grade that ought to be uncovered and honestly reported. This is, to put it mildly, an extremely simplistic and outdated view of knowledge and of learning. But remarkably, learning rarely even figures into these discussions. The dominant disciplinary sensibility here is not education, where we talk about teaching and assessing. It's economics. The very term grade inflation, when you think about it, that's just a metaphor. And it's an economic metaphor. And I think our understanding of the broader issues here is going to be quite limited if we confine ourselves to a vocabulary of that discipline, of inputs and outputs and incentives and resource distribution, compensation. That's the realm in which we're talking about grades being inflated. And why does this possibility upset some people in the way that it does? What are critics assuming about the nature of, students' motivation to learn, about the purpose of evaluation, of education itself? I think there are four fundamental assumptions that need to be unpacked that lie behind all the criticism we read in the newspaper and hear from universities and high school administrators about grade inflation. So, assumption number one is that if a lot of the students are getting A's, that proves that the work they're doing is too easy. Higher grades means lower standards. Okay, two problems with this right off the bat. The first is this conflates the curriculum, how difficult the books are that they're reading or the ideas that they're analyzing, with the techniques used to assess the student's performance, like tests or essays or projects or whatever, as if these two are moving in lockstep or that they should. The reality is they don't and they shouldn't. And there are plenty of classrooms where the material being learned is very challenging, but the teacher might not be all that stringent in terms of what you have to do to get a high grade, or vice versa. But the second and much more, I think, troubling assumption here is that harder is the same as better. I'm not going to say more about that in general now because I did a whole episode on Cohn's Zone called Confusing Harder with Better. But we ought to look into this notion of standards, higher, lower academic standards. What are academic standards? Are we talking about high standards meaning depth of exploration of ideas, skill at formulating questions, how incisive the student's thinking is, whether they're able to, look at problems from different perspectives? Are they open to new ways of looking at the world? Or can they apply knowledge to new questions that come up, making distinctions and connections? Are we deciding that a course has high standards to the degree to which it has a lasting impact on habits of mind and so on? I mean, fill in your own there. Or do we mean by high academic standards that not many kids get A's? I mean, I'd like to think it's the former, but there are a lot of teachers and professors who pride themselves not on the intellectual depth and value of what they're teaching, but on how much reading they assign, how hard their tests are, how rarely they award good grades. You're going to have to work in here. The kind of machismo, which is like fueled by self-congratulation. These are the kind of people who look with contempt on those easy graders, in the other departments who are too lazy to care or too worried about how students will evaluate them or too concerned about students' self-esteem, whereas we are the last defenders of what used to matter in the good old days. High standards, intellectual honesty, no free lunch. And often these people who are grumbling about grade inflation seem to exude this cranky impatience with the kids, the adolescents or young adults sitting in their classrooms. Especially at the college level, you get a lot of these professors went into this profession to do research, and they view teaching as like an occupational hazard. It's something they're not very good at. They were never trained for. They'd rather avoid it. And now they're, in effect, taking it out on the students and complaining that too many students taught by other people are getting A's. So the more we refocus on what I think is a more legitimate understanding of high standards, the more we disentangle better from harder, the less worried we become about so-called grade inflation. So that's assumption number one, that higher grades must mean lower standards. The second problematic assumption is that the teacher's job is to sort students for the benefit of whoever is coming next. The college admissions committee if you're in high school, the graduate student admissions committee if you're in college, or employers. So grade inflation, apart from its problematic fact that it's rooted in economics, is a bit of a misnomer because what they're really concerned about is what could be called grade compression. The problem they're arguing is that if too many students are getting A's, it's harder to spread them out on a continuum, ranking them against each other for the benefit of these constituencies that come later and will need to know who's better than whom. One professor put it this way: why would anyone subscribe to Consumer's Digest if every blender were rated a best buy? Okay, I'm glad you asked. First, the assumption under this assumption is that grades offer useful information. That's not what the data show. What the data show are that grades and test scores don't predict anything in the future except future grades and test scores. High school grades don't really predict academic achievement in college to a significant extent. Test scores are even a poorer predictor, and so on. And The people who do the best in their careers, in medicine, in law, in academics, and in other fields are not typically the ones who had the highest grade point average in college or in law or medical school, interestingly. So that already calls this concern into question. But secondly, and more importantly, is this marketplace analogy, blenders, really apt? Is the teacher's job to rate students like appliances for the convenience of corporations or admissions committees? Or is the teacher's job to offer feedback to help students learn more skillfully and enthusiastically? By the way, even consumer magazines don't grade on a curve. If every blender meets a reasonable set of performance criteria, they see that as good news and are happy to report it. Which reminds me of something that Harry Lewis said once. Harry Lewis was the dean of Harvard College from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. And he had a similar take on both of these responses that I'm offering here to the sorting, ranking job. He gave a talk about this while he was a dean. And he said, I'm paraphrasing here, I went to the supermarket and I couldn't find any grade B milk. I couldn't find any grade C eggs in the store. Isn't that interesting? They all got A's and nobody's concerned. When he did some historical research, he found that these used to exist, sort of. Many, many years ago, you could go into a grocery store and find like lower standard dairy products, but shoppers didn't buy them, so the dairies improved their standards and produced only grade A products for the stores, and nobody complained about how standards were falling. And let me quote what he said next, Dean Lewis. There is no sense at all that the consumers of our products, here he means the graduates of the college, are unhappy with what we produce. We certify a minimum standard with our diplomas, and our consumers choose among our graduates on criteria other than grades, not because they can't use our grades to discriminate, but because they recognize that for most purposes, the most important things differentiating one student from another are not course grades, but things like courage, ambition, mental toughness, integrity, imagination, compassion, capacity to rebound from reversals, a desire to leave the world a better place than you found it. Third assumption driving the complaints about grade inflation is that grades motivate students. So the idea here is that kids will work harder in school if A's are harder to come by. All right? That sounds like an empirical proposition. What does the research say? It says that stringent grading at the college level sometimes boosts short-term retention of facts as measured by multiple choice tests. But no evidence suggests that stringent grading improves students' understanding of ideas, let alone does it promote their excitement, their enthusiasm about learning. One study done by a couple of California economists, Julian Betts and Jeff Grogger, found that tougher grading was initially correlated with higher test scores, but the long-term effects were negligible, except with minority students for whom the long-term effects were negative. All right, let's go a step further. What matters isn't how motivated students are. It's how students are motivated. And here we look at the research on grades in general, which I have talked about on other episodes and will just briefly summarize here. Students focused on grades tend to think less deeply, prefer less challenging tasks, and become less interested in learning compared to a carefully matched set of students who are not being graded at all. That research suggests that the problem isn't the number of A's, it's the number of students who've been led to think that the point of school is to get an A. Or to put it differently, the key contrast is not between how many kids get A's versus B's and C's. The key contrast is between intrinsically and extrinsically motivated students. And the more stringent your grading, the more you're fighting a battle against so-called grade inflation and making damn sure that not too many kids get A's, the more you lead students to focus on grades as opposed to learning, and the more damage you do. I mean, consider how a grade orientation affects a learning orientation. Well, that's empirical too. Research by a group of people, including Omer Milton, have found they are inversely related. Not perfectly so. It is theoretically and empirically possible to be high on both or low on both. But in general, as a grade orientation goes up in students' minds, they become less focused on learning. So that for a lot of students, the question uppermost on their mind when they come to class is not, what do these ideas mean? It's, do we have to know this? Now there's a crisis. There's something worthy of outraged editorials and special committees and symposia. So you got to ask, if stringent grading doesn't lead to higher achievement, if it doesn't motivate in the sense of promoting and sustaining intrinsic motivation, what's the advantage? So I know a psychology professor in upstate New York, and he told me this story. He was having lunch at the faculty club, and he happened to sit at a table with some professors in the hard sciences, one of whom welcomed him jokingly when he sat down. "Oh, look who it is from the Department of Grade Inflation." Well, my friend was not just going to take that with a smile. He said, let's assume what you claim is true, that our grades are in our department are inflated, which he was actually not about to concede and doesn't believe is true at all. So when you give out those low grades in your chemistry class, what exactly is your educational goal? What are you trying to accomplish with that? Are you encouraging students to make more effort? And do they do that? And they conceded probably not. Are your students more excited about chemistry? No. Does it lead to more of them or fewer of them wanting to keep studying chemistry if it's impossible to get A's there? Well, fewer. If a lot of them are doing badly in the class, does that suggest good or bad teaching? Okay, now they weren't happy. The irritable response was, you can't tell the quality of the teaching from the average grades. Interesting, said my friend. So that means that higher grades also have no implication for the quality of teaching. But if a lot of them are faring poorly, isn't it possible that maybe the teaching wasn't so great? Or maybe your expectations were too optimistic, which is also a teacher problem, not a student problem or a grade problem? He went on to say this: the main people from whom I hear complaints about grade inflation are teachers who get low teaching ratings from students. They attribute everyone else's high ratings to the grades being inflated. So if I suck as a teacher, I can write off your positive student evaluations by claiming the grades were inflated, and I can explain away my poor ratings by claiming that it's because of my tough grading. Which all begs the question of what is being learned here. Maybe it's better to assume that if I teach well, students do learn more and they perform better too. So shouldn't they get a grade that reflects that? Fourth assumption, students should be set against each other in a race for artificially scarce rewards. This is the one that I really want to underscore. So even if you could show that a lot of kids are getting high grades because their performance was high quality, a lot of the critics wouldn't care. This took me quite a while to realize, to really come to understand that we were talking at cross purposes here. I'm asking if it's possible that the A's are appropriate. And they're not saying, no, and here's the proof that they didn't earn the A. They're saying lots of A's can never be appropriate because the purpose of grades isn't to communicate the quality of learning, in which case we should hope for 100% of the kids to get A's if you have to give grades. The purpose is to rank the students against one another. Harvey Mansfield, a very conservative political science professor at Harvard, said the essence of grading is exclusiveness. Students should have to compete with each other. Doesn't matter whether they're all learning more or working harder. As another critic of grade inflation, a philosopher named Richard Camber, put it, if grades are to have any coherent meaning, they need to represent a relative degree of success. Well, that's an odd view of coherent meaning. So the point here on this view isn't to do well. It's to defeat other people who are also trying to do well. And if the students have already been sorted via admissions so that elite institutions contain the very best, well, they have to be sorted again within those institutions. No matter how well they all do, only a few should ever get A's. You see what this means? It means the question we're trying to ask here isn't how well are they learning, it's who's beating whom. The school's ultimate mission, apparently then, isn't to help everyone learn as well as possible. It's to rig the game so there will always be losers. That's not just a view in some elite institutions. That is a larger view in American society, I think, to view excellence as an inherently scarce commodity. So if any group of people meet a set criteria, a lot of them do, we automatically assume that must mean the bar was set too low, and we have to ratchet it upward until more people fail. Everyone can't be excellent. That's not an empirical proposition that can be tested. It's a matter of deep ideology. The complaints about grade inflation are just one of many illustrations of that ideology. Give credit to the conservative critics like Mansfield and Camber. They're taking this dark conception of education and of life, really, and they're putting it right out there. It's all about school is a race in which most people can't prevail. But a lot of other people hold this same view, but implicitly, and they pretend that everybody doesn't have to fail. They're like exhorting everybody to strive to be winners, even though everybody by definition can't be a winner. Everybody can be, I believe, can be theoretically excellent or successful, but winning means only some. All of us can't attain this status. It's like my friend Debbie Meyer's example of the teacher in the elementary school who says, okay, kids, I want you all to line up for lunch now, and I want everybody to be in the front half of the line. Apart from all the other problems with this scarcity mentality, which fuels the complaints about grade inflation, the fact is that relative judgments almost never tell you anything that matters. You can be damned good, but still be tagged as a loser in a selective pool if we're giving relative ratings. What's the point of relative judgments, especially in an institution that's supposed to be about learning? I mean, the reverse is true too. You can be not so impressive, but if you're better than everybody else in a group of poorly performing students or workers or whatever, you look good according to the ratings, because they're not just ratings, they're rankings. And rankings are uninformative at best, or actually, I think, misleading. The number of peers a student has bested tells you nothing about how much she knows or is able to do. And it becomes counterproductive because these grading policies lead to a competitive climate that's counterproductive for the winners and the losers because it discourages free exchange of ideas and a sense of community, which is really conducive to exploration. So when you've got a student body that's grade-oriented, that is an invitation to ask hard questions about what's going on. What unexamined assumptions are keeping traditional grading in its place? What forms of assessment might be less destructive? How can teachers minimize the salience of grades in their classroom, as long as they have to give grades in the end? And, here's another question. If the artificial inducement of grades to make students do the assignment disappeared, what sort of teaching strategies might elicit students' authentic interest in the course, in the subject that they're learning? To ask those kinds of questions, to observe real classrooms, to review the relevant research, I think all leads to one overriding conclusion. The real threat to learning and to excellence in school isn't grade inflation at all. It's grades.